Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I am delighted to welcome you all to the first spring lecture of the Pembroke Seminar in the Afterlives and Aftermaths of Ruin. My name is Aliyah Abdurrahman, and it has been my great fortune to be the seminar leader this year. I'm an associate professor of English and American Studies here at Brown. Over the course of 1 year, seminar participants and I have been engaged in the study and conceptualization of ruin, along with modalities of survival and persistence, epistemologies of emergence and immanence, praxes of rupture and critique, maneuvers of sustenance and suture. We've considered ruin in terms of temporality, affect, aesthetic praxis, social life, and political need. The ultimate aims of our year-long seminar have been to theorize systems and semantics of endurance and to promote reparative social, ethical, relational, ecological, and political infrastructures amidst the ruin of our times. We are very, very, very fortunate, and I am unbelievably happy to have with us this evening Dr. Xine Yao. Dr. Yao is a lecturer in American literature to 1900, as well as coordinator of the Queer Studies Network, QUCL, at University College London. Their work has appeared in such venues as American Quarterly, Early American Literature, Journal of Asian American Studies, 18th-Century Fiction, Occasion, and J19, the Journal of 19th-Century Americanists. Their first book, entitled Disaffected, The Cultural Politics of Unfeeling in 19th-Century America, was published by Duke University Press in 2021. Disaffected won Duke University Press's Scholar of Color First Book Award, as well as honorable mention for the Arthur Miller First Book Prize from the British Association of American Studies. Dr. Yao is also a BBC Radio 3A HRC New Generation thinker and the co-host of PH Divas podcast. By theorizing feeling otherwise as an antisocial effect, form of dissent, and mode of care, Dr. Yao's talk this evening will demonstrate that unfeeling can serve as a contemporary political strategy for people of color to survive in the face of continuing racism and white fragility. Dr. Yao will speak for about an hour, and we will then have about a half hour for Q&A. At that time, when it's time for Q&A, I'll ask you to please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens. But for now, I'm utterly delighted to now turn things over to Dr. Xine Yao. Welcome.
Thank you for having me. You just set this up. Can everyone hear me clearly? Hopefully. So it really is a blessing that I'm able to, be here to hopefully meet a lot of you tomorrow at the seminar, because I originally was supposed to come in December, but I was struck down by long COVID, and I'm actually in the process of recovering from it right now. So I'm really grateful for the flexibility that the center has shown in being able to reschedule me. So again, thank you so much to Professor Aliyah Abdurrahman for inviting me. Thank you so much to Wendy Lee for also helping to coordinate, but also especially Diane Straker and Donna Goodnow. I would not be here if it hadn't been for their administrative help in order to try and coordinate my journey from the other side of the pond. And I also thank you for inviting me to this place where I hope that Brown University will make good on its commitments to honor and recognize the relationship of the Narragansett Indian tribe and the other indigenous peoples to the lands now called Providence. And I think it's only appropriate to be doing this talk with this theme in the afterlives and aftermaths of ruin. And I also think it's helpful perhaps to locate where exactly in these afterlives do I find myself located. So I hail to you from the former heart of empire, originally from the place of so-called Canada, where my family are immigrant settlers, from the abandoned colonial outpost of Hong Kong, a place I've never been, although I've definitely been told to go back to it on numerous occasions. And yes, here I am now, struggling with long COVID. So if I need to pause or take a drink of water, please be patient with me. I think my mental acuity has also been somewhat dimmed. And so again, I appreciate your generosity. So I think locating it in this particular moment is actually quite convenient because, of course, it's Valentine's Day. And I just had this last minute update I wanted to share with you. Oh, change my stuff. So again, today is Valentine's Day. And also on this day in the UK, my union is on strike. And our union is a union representing not just academics across the entire UK, but also librarians, administrative staff, professional services staff, lab staff. And we are undergoing our largest strike campaign since. This morning, I got a message from one of my friends who is on the picket at King's College London. And she let me know that one of her friends had shared this particular essay by Clémence et Clémentine against the couple forum. And as I read it, I couldn't help but think it was the perfect epigraph to open this talk about unfeeling, the cultural politics of unfeeling, on this very day where the capitalist, cis heteronormative restrictions are in this society are perhaps particularly clear to us. So, see if I could also read it in front of the Zoom message. So, in this pathetic, stillborn world, we do still have feelings. Sometimes we look at someone and think we are in love with them. We must crush the illusion that romance is or will be an avenue for liberation. We must divest from romantic relationships as means through which we might access a better world than this one. And realizing that their economies and conventions are part and parcel of the continuing soft disaster of our lives, we will now leave behind all hitherto existing couples. New and perhaps unknown forms of feminist organizing present the only possible frontier for love. And I have to say, it's particularly meaningful to me to be invited by Professor Alia Abdur-Rahman to the Pembroke Center for the Research and Teaching of Women's Studies, because, of course, as people probably are only too well aware, in the UK right now, it's the amount of transphobia is alarmingly high. And I also hail from someone at an institution where many of the anti-trans academics who give information to the media, but also to the UK and Scottish governments, actually operate, protected by the aegis of academic freedom, while we also level critiques against them, protect by academic freedom, and yet they're also paradoxically protected by it. It's also, my institution is also the home of eugenics. Sir Francis Galton, the cousin of Charles Darwin, who coined the term eugenics, had no official affiliation with University College London, but his disciples were major figures, and many sites on campus were named after him. And so this part of eugenics, this aftermath of eugenics, and has transmuted into other forms of racism, anti-Black racism, transphobia, misogyny, and ableism, all intertwined, very much informs the project that I'm trying to work with, thinking about unfeeling, and the sort of practice I try to have, not just as a researcher, but as a teacher and as someone trying to work for advocacy in the community. So the way that I decided to approach this talk was a bit of as a pastiche, knowing that some people have read my work, but others have not. And so I'd be sort of going between talking from Disaffected, as well as sharing my reflections on this work. And I think that this is part of the sort of the necessary work of unveiling and peeling back the veneer of professionalism, of detached professionalism that I do refer to in my introduction, that goes behind the labor of a first book. And so I address this particularly to those of you who are junior and emerging scholars, because there's so many times when I went to talks like these during my PhD, and I couldn't help but think, how the hell did they get there? And I felt like, and to just see work that just seems so polished and it just seems so far away. And personally, as I was doing my studies, like I eventually realized like Duke University Press was this place that so many different thinkers who doing work that I cared about were publishing at. And to suddenly be a part of that seems like an almost unbelievable transition to me. And so I want to make very explicit the difficulties and sort of in agony that go into that at a time of only increasing precarity for higher education globally, and the eroding of the humanities. And I think as you'll discover that in many ways, I tried to tap into my sense of precarity, imposter syndrome, the difficulty of moving between countries for different stages of my career, health problems, and tried to transmute it into something that was deeply informed by my lived experience, although in the structure of my book, it's something that I only reveal at the very end. And so this is how I open the book. White feelings, white tears, white fragility, white women's tears, white men's tears. These phrases circulate within popular anti-racist social justice discourse galvanized by the Black Lives Matter movement. These phrases articulate frustration with the ongoing manifestations of what scholars have variously called the unfinished business of sentimentality, the legacies of the intimacies of four continents, and the biopolitics of feeling. They name the weaponization of white feelings in everyday life. Behind these uses is the implicit statement: we know, indeed have always known, that white feelings produce and maintain structures of domination. To depend upon white feelings as the catalyst for social change reinscribes the world that enables their power. So, no more business with white sentimentality. Withhold from those colonial intimacies. Refuse to feel according to the hierarchies of the biopolitics of feeling. Be disaffected. There is ambivalence, there is discontent. And part of what particularly galvanized the way that I was thinking about this came out of a 2017 polemic by the writer and popular social media critic, Robert Jones Jr., known as Sana Baldwin, who wrote from a Black queer perspective. And this essay was called "I Don't Give a Fuck About Justine Damon," originally published on Facebook, but eventually republished in the Paris Review, where he breaks down the dynamics of behind the killing of an unarmed white American woman by a Black police officer. And he talks about the dynamics of racialized sympathy and emotional labor tied to legacies of Black enslavement. He says, most white people rely on this idea that Black people, in situations where white people are in pain, are only ever to be soothing and understanding, only ever to be Mommy or Uncle Remus, only ever to extend condolences, only ever to embody loyalty, only ever to offer the sympathy and empathy that most white people purposely and haughtily deny when the situation is reversed, almost as if most white people still see us as their property. When the situation is reversed, when we require empathy and sympathy, then suddenly we're all of the opposite things that these once needy white people previously said we were. When the shoe is on the other foot, then they assess us as immoral, violent, criminal, subhuman, unworthy. Black and Indigenous women who are victims of police brutality, as Sana Baldwin points out, do not receive the same sympathy. So writing several years after the emergence of the Black Lives Matter movement, he chooses to be unsympathetic about the death of Justine Damon, despite the anger he knows his stand for provoke. My disinterest is white people's fault, he declares. In a follow-up post, he asserts that he's unmoved by the backlash he has received from enraged white readers withdrawing their allyship to those he calls the Black/brown domestics, who insist on the importance of white feelings. Quote, and I think I'll do this to let people know when I'm quoting, it's a bit clearer. Sentimentality, the ostentatious parading of excessive and spurious emotion, accused James Baldwin in his indictment of Harriet Beecher Stowe's paradigmatic protest novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin, is the mark of dishonesty, the inability to feel. The wet eyes of the sentimentalist betray his aversion to experience, his fear of life, his arid heart, and is always, therefore, the signal of secret and violent inhumanity, the mask of cruelty. Referring to his heart already full to capacity for all the dead Black people killed by police, Sana Baldwin develops the antisocial affective implications of his name-to-stakes critique. I am very much onto something with Black apathy as radical opposition to their toxic ecology, and I believe it may be key to liberation, he concludes. The violence of white tears described by James Baldwin becomes projected onto those who refuse to be moved by them and are condemned as the ones unable to feel, with arid hearts, secret and violent inhumanity. Nonetheless, Sana Baldwin rejects that unspoken social contract of sympathy, for those unfeeling vilifications are already built into the structure of the United States predicated upon Black enslavement and Indigenous dispossession. And so in my first book, I'm looking to the American literature, the American literature of the long 19th century to rethink the ongoing racial and sexual politics of unfeeling, not as oppression from above, but as a tactic from below. And indeed, I think this is a point that I want to say is important to really stress. Again, not in this usual form of oppression from above, those who need to be swayed, but then as a tactic from below. And indeed, what I find fascinating is that a response that I've gotten from US audiences when I've given this talk, well, also from white audience members, or what I think are white audience members usually, is like, well, what about unfeeling Trump voters, disaffected Trump voters? And then in the British context, I've also repeatedly gotten from people who I believe are white British people, well, what about disaffected Brexit voters, for instance? And my point is, why is it that they're always recognized as the ones who are disaffected? Think of all the New York Times inches that have been given to like trying to plumb the depths of the psychology of the disaffected Trump voter, whereas so many minoritized, racialized, queer, and otherwise minoritarian people do not ever get that same platform to have their very disaffection recognized, almost being erased from being seen as being viable or affected, or in either the capacity to affect or disaffect. And so in my work, I'm trying to read against the grain of the cultural sentiment, to refuse that usual move that we so often see of arguing for the humanity of minoritized subjects by enlisting literature to affirm that they feel too. With this project, I'm trying to ask what we can apprehend if we stay with the negativity of unfeeling and suspend its rehabilitation. And through this provocation, I seek to excavate unfeeling, occluded by the stifling imperatives of the political stakes of sympathy. And indeed, this is where I draw inspiration from Harriet Jacobs' preface to the Incidents of the Life of a Slave Girl, where she has to signal her ambivalence about the political necessity of writing about herself as a formerly enslaved Black woman, who is keenly aware of the stakes of her reworking of the genre of the slave narrative and the conventions of sentimentalism. I have not written my experiences in order to attract attention to myself. On the contrary, it would be more pleasant to me to have been silent about my own history. Neither do I care to excite sympathy for my own sufferings, but I do earnestly desire to arouse the women of the North to realizing a sense of the condition of 2 millions of women in the South, still in bondage, suffering what I suffered, and most of them far worse. So this might look familiar to some of you. This is from the app CoStar, for all those of you who follow astrology. And I thought this would be a good segue to basically do that thing where record scratch. How did I find myself here with this first book? I never thought that I'd be someone who could write the sort of words that open my book. Indeed, in no way did it ever, in my dissertation phase, did I ever dream about being able to write in that sort of fashion, to be able to talk about my influences, to speak so directly. It was only something that came after I finished my PhD, and the sort of education, re-education that happened through my postdoc and through many other experiences outside of academia that I want to speak to. And indeed, when I went back to the place of my postdoc, the University of British Columbia on the unceded traditional territory of the Musqueam people, I had a friend who was going to tune into my talk, and they let me know, hey, my co-star today had this to say, and I think it's really relevant to share it for your talk. And I was like, this is perfect. Can I please use it for my talk? And I gave them permission. So as you can say, good morning. It's Tuesday, April 19th. Today, at a glance, it's okay to cycle between feeling and not feeling. And I want to sort of talk about the way that early on in my graduate studies, on some level, I decided, not consciously, that I would not work on affect studies, nor did I think I would be the kind of person who did theory. And I'd say that that was still the case now. And indeed, the sort of oddness of going between what seemed to be the poles in academia of imposter syndrome and a type of megalomania. Instead, what tries to motivate me is a quotation that I saw from Roderick Ferguson, referring to advice that he got from Lisa Lowe. But he said, where she said to him, apparently, that rather than making work that's for yourself, what's most important is making work that is useful for others. And so that's something that I very much have in mind. So again, the sense of feeling out of the space of affect studies. Teresa Brennan opens her influential exploration about the transmission of affect by asking, is there anyone who has not, at least once, walked into a room and felt the atmosphere? Later, she walks back into that atmospheric room, telling the reader, "It is rank with the smell of anxiety. I breathe this in." What then does it mean to walk out of the room and not return? To try one's best not to breathe that atmosphere. As Brennan remarks, the affect in the room is a profoundly social thing. My contrarian impulse, when I first read this, to thwart transmission if not diminish it, to remuse myself, no matter how vain the gesture may be. And I wondered that first time what the antisocial implications might be. The room anecdote is a universal illustration, yet there are many ways in which the act of entering rooms is differently contoured for each of us, particularly when one is used to being the only one in the room. Which rooms, who is in the room, all part of the calculus towards the careful effective reading of the atmosphere in the room, sometimes in order to steel oneself, be it preemptively or in the shock of the moment, against that atmosphere. Indeed, Sarah Ahmed meditates upon Brenna's anecdote. She says, "So we may walk into the room and feel the atmosphere, but what we feel depends on the angle of our arrival. Or we may say that the atmosphere is already angled, it is already felt from a specific point. One possibility is alienation," she says. "We become alienated, out of line with the effective community. We do not experience pleasure from proximity to objects as of being treated as being good." And from this comes her influential and recurrent concept of the affect alien, which one can become in such moments when we experience that gap between the promise of a feeling and the feeling of a feeling. The feminist killjoy, the unhappy queer, the melancholic migrant are variously some of the overlapping types of the affect alien, which he details across her work. And then, of course, years later, after reading both her work and Teresa Brennan's, I would publish these words. What, then, are the implications of alienation from affect itself? And so here are my 3 points about the way that Unfeeling operates. And I have to read my slides, so I have to just move my little Zoom window. That first, I consider Unfeeling as index of the under-acknowledged spectrum of dissonance and dissent that critiques the demands of sympathetic recognition shaped by sentimentalism, questioning the liberal politics of inclusion. Second, I explore Unfeeling in both the responsive and demonstrative senses as a quotidian tactic of survival and a counterintuitive, sometimes counteractive mode of care. And finally, I propose that these antisocial affects are vilified as unfeeling because they have insurgent potential that may not be legible or instrumentalized towards resistance. And I want to turn to just one particular part in my introduction that I was particularly proud of, which was also sort of an experiment in writing that, again, I did not think, it was not something that I was trained in, but suddenly I gave myself permission to do, is where I try to illustrate what do I mean by unfeeling. So I have these 3 points that I was able to break down, but then I also have this litany that I use unfeeling as a broad term for a range of affective modes, performances, moments, patterns, and practices that fall outside or are not legible using dominant regimes of expression. The range includes withholding, disregard, growing a thick skin, refusing to care, opacity, numbness, dissociation, inscrutability, frigidity, insensibility, obduracy, flatness, insensitivity, disinterest, coldness, and heartlessness, fatigue, desensitization, emotional unavailability, and as I like to also riff, if I was going to write it now, after the inception of the COVID-19 pandemic, burnout. In short, people who are disaffected break from affectability and present themselves as unaffected. Inexpressive expressions stubbornly contradict the supposed universality of affects encompassing intensities, tracking the edges of their influences, and suggesting a beyond to their limits. But how did I get here, and how did I come to think this way? So these are the epigraphs that I begin my book with, from Denise Ferrer da Silva, from Martin F. Manalanson IV, and Edward Glissant. And I'm offering these as a few representative, but no means exhaustive assemblage of citational meditations on my own dissatisfaction, dissent, disaffection with what variously gets called feeling, emotion, affect. And again, as I wrote in my introduction to disaffection, in contradistinction to the insistence on affect in relation to attachments and porousness, we need to acknowledge the effective importance of detachments and boundaries. How do citations constellate thinking, galvanize nebulous feelings, provoke unfeeling withdrawal, withholding? Citation can variously operate as tokenism, a retroactive justificatory armor for argument, product and producer and critical insight. Discipline is empire, warns Catherine McKittrick, drawing from the work of Sylvia Wynter, Edward Said, and Paul Gilroy to discuss how academic institutions taxonomize and control what she calls identity disciplines. She goes on to state, our starting point must be one of disobedient relationality with that always questions and thus is not beholden to normative academic logics. Citation marks intellectual and effective engagement, not a linear trajectory from reading to writing, nor the colonial mastery of discipline, but an uneven haunting of resonances that persist in the brain and bone. And so here I'm trying to read carefully and critically in this sort of meta way, my own work through this lens, with what I can now recognize as kind of effective disobedience that only years later rises to the level of articulation. And I also would not be able to do this had it not been for the generosity of the many people who have invited me for talks, and many of those talks being often ones that are being organized by junior scholars, PhD students themselves. And so this is particularly why I want to sort of unveil a lot of the difficult thinking that went into this work. So for instance, why did I cite Manalanson over Berlant? To cite Berlant on affect is an expectation, if not a given. I present another citational convergence, an overlapping in which one citation may be seen to occlude the other, rather than placed alongside, ajar, or its presence lurking beneath, a palimpsest. In his study of how queer Filipinx migrant workers undergird the global care economy, Martin F. Manalanson beautifully articulates the disaffection of his subjects as they labor and despite their labor. By disaffection, I emphasize not only emotional distance, alienation, antipathy, and isolation, but also to center this other connotation of disloyalty to regimes of power. Manalanson's queer color critique of affect provides one of my epigraphs. His insight resonates with me in ways otherwise from, although not necessarily unlike, Berlant's essay on the structures of unfeeling and the novel and film Mysterious Skin, to which I also pay citational homage later in my book. Another form of citation that is no less about the reproduction of the technology of discipline, the recounting of the anecdote about encountering the kind of person one cite. In this case, the only time that I ever met and spoke to Berlant. I told them shyly, I was thinking about Unfeeling and Oriental inscrutability. They pointed me to that 2015 essay published earlier that same year. I read it. I cite it. A year later, a conference panel with fellow graduate students working on Asian diasporic studies yields the mutual sharing of knowledge. A friend generously shares a scan of the Manalanson essay. His theorizing is revelatory for me. The essay itself is epiphanic in other ways, since I noticed that his acknowledgments give explicit thanks to Berlant for their generosity and incisive comments. In this 2010 collection, his essay comes before another essay that's far more familiar to me. The last page of that scan presents the end of Manalanson citations on the left, and on the right, the opening of a reprint of Berlant's 2008 essay on thinking about feeling historical, to which I was introduced many years prior. It was far easier for me to encounter Berlant than to encounter Manalanson, despite the affirmation of their textual juxtaposition and the confirmation of editorial conversations. Manalanson's discussion of queer racialized disaffection precedes Berlant's Mysterious Skin essay on underperformativity that is far more widely read and cited. In rereading Berlant, I observed that they do discuss the labor aspect of an expression, which they say is often deemed good manners in the servant class. They do not cite Manalanson's earlier essay, although he cites them and alludes to formative exchanges they had that led to his argument. Much of citation can be a reductive act. I am mindful that I do not want to be reductive about reading the citational practices of others. Rather, I give you this pairing in the sort of genealogy of my reading that continues to make me reflect on how we encounter our readings and how citations provide one entry point into networks of intellectual engagement that we find ourselves in media res. Nonetheless, for my own sake, I decide to position Manalanson as one of my introductory epigraphs, integrating my citation of Berlant later on. And I see this positioning not as an oppositional practice, but rather an appositional one. And I also say that this sort of rethinking about citation and affect studies is something that has been noticed by Sara Ahmed, but also by more recent queer colored junior scholars like Claudia Garcia Rojas and Tyrone S. Palmer. who published while they were also still in graduate school on this sort of thinking. And I also wanted to juxtapose another really formative number of quotations that I analyze in my book, and to sort of put them so sharply next to each other as a way of disrupting them. On the one hand, of course, Adam Smith, so one of the paradigmatic Enlightenment philosophers, and then Sherry Moraga from this book, Call Me Back, the radical collection by radical women of color. And just seeing what that sort of juxtaposition, apposition, opposition does in terms of being able to speak to, against grains, towards other possibilities. If you're familiar with early 19th century American literary studies, so many people like to quote the opening of Adam Smith's The Theory of Moral Sentiments, where he lays out the definition of the theory of moral sentiments, about like one person imagining themselves as if being another. And that's tends to mobilize. It's often in introductions of so many works, and not to be dismissive of them because I found it so formative, but eventually it's just like, it's so telling to me that people often cite that in early in 19th century American literature, to talk about all these frameworks of sentiment and sympathy that undergird the nation and citizenship. But I decided that I wanted to continue reading the Adam Smith, and then that's when I came across this quotation, which I haven't seen in my fields of study that I just cited, although they cite the opening, which is like much further in to this admittedly 600-page book or so. About halfway through, that's when Adam Smith really drops the guise of the sort of universalism that dominates the first half of Theory of Moral Sentiments. And he says, "It has been observed by all those who've been conversant with savage nations, whether in Asia, Africa, or America, that they are equally impenetrable, and that when they have a mind to conceal the truth, no examination is capable of drawing it from them." And this is a fascinating moment for me of being like, oh, so wait a second, this is how it's being writ large, not just but in an abstract way, or even along the lines of criminality, which he does discuss in the earlier part of Theory of Moral Sentiments, but then that sort of criminality which becomes associated with presumably white Western subjects, then becomes writ large upon all the peoples of Asia, Africa, and America. And one can't help but think this sort of misrecognition, this fatal misrecognition of a type of anti-colonial sentiment that could be part of what sort of a type of disaffected anti-colonial global solidarity in its possibility and coit form from people within Asia, across Africa, across the Americas. This sort of a potential alliance between being the acronym that now gets bandied so much about BIPOC. And instead to sort of think like, how do we read against the grain of, for instance, Enlightenment thinkers for what they're misrecognizing, they're including, and to do so in a way that shows how generative these forms of unfeeling are, rather than simply being saying like, no, but they are penetrable, that they do tell the truth, but at the same time, why would they want to tell the truth to someone like Adam Smith, to a colonial colonizer informant, for instance? Why would they, if they're impenetrable, why would they want to be penetrative in the sort of way that, again, says violence, both physical and sexual combined? And so I juxtapose this with the Sherry Moraga, where she says, "Our strategy is how we cope, how we measure and weigh what is to be said and when, what is to be done and how, and to whom and to whom and to whom, daily deciding / risking who it is we can call a friend, call an ally, call a friend." And so that's why I looked to queer and feminist color theorists whose underappreciated contributions to the intellectual histories of feeling are themselves erased from the as embraced in terms of feeling in the dominant episteme, which then I say paradoxically positions them as thinkers who uniquely pay attention to this disaffected sense of unfeeling. Unlike the affront of unfeeling to Smith's fellow feeling that he talks about, in this tradition, I suggest we can track unfeeling as a theory in the flesh, not as opposition to feeling necessarily, but its complement and lived experience within the effective hierarchies of biopolitics. And then I turn to that quotation from Sherry Moraga. The fact that there is this necessary calculus of refusals, the apparent lack or dulling of affect can be a defensive tactic of everyday psychic survival in a world predicated upon racial and sexual violences. To cope with hurt and control my fears, I grew a thick skin, states Ansel Dua, and Audre Lorde writes, in order to withstand the weather, we had to become stone. Their images of thick skin and stone indicate that the callousness of insensitivity may be a development of an affective callous, protective hardening of the sensitive psyche against the wear and tear of everyday life and the repetitive tasks of racialized and gendered emotional labor. However, uncritical valorization of unfeeling as triumphant resistance ignores its risks. As Ansel Dua acknowledges, the tactic runs the risk of being misread and vilified. I am not the frozen snow queen, but a flesh and blood woman with perhaps too loving a heart, one easily hurt. This antisocial armor can be turned against those it is meant to protect, for Lorde notes that the cultivation of a stony exterior can lead to Black women hurting other Black women. We bruise ourselves upon the other who is closest. Unfeeling can be a dangerous gambit, but the pathologization of its manifestations obscures how cultivating unresponsiveness and inexpressiveness is an effect of the structural alienations in the culture of sentiment and symptoms of dissatisfaction. And so why and how did I come to unfeeling? As I say in my book, I suspect that there is a congruence between processes of disaffection and Jose Esteban Munoz's disidentifications. The suspension of relationality allows for creative remakings and the struggle to reach the horizon of queerness with its potentialities and possibilities. Unfeeling is the detachment from attachments to hegemonic structures of feeling and the potential for striving towards a radical politics or liberation. The ruse of detached scholarly objectivity can be a defense of opacity. So too may an expression of vulnerability, a tactical disclosure, not necessarily opposed to, but rather a complementary component of the same assemblage of theory in the flesh. And so I opened with a couple of different conceits about, well, the opening of my book. That first I began with how I spoke, but of course that wasn't true because then of course I shared the epigraphs that preceded the lines of my introduction. And now here is actually what I really believe begin with, which is the acknowledgements. And I think that acknowledgement sections are particularly speak to the conditions of possibility to the book itself. And just as a brief warning, I will be talking about suicidal ideation and self-harm. And so again, before my arguments, before any theorizing, before even my epigraphs, I opened Disaffected with this sentence. One of the most fundamental conditions of possibility for finishing this book, a condition that too often remains unmentioned, was staying alive. I wonder if this line makes any readers pause. I wonder if it makes anyone uncomfortable. I wonder if anyone brushes it aside. I wonder if anyone finds it resonates with them in that moment, or whether they find it returns to them later. I wrote about the racial and sexual politics of unfeeling and survival toward the possibility of flourishing because I managed to hold on. But because of the care of others hurting in ways akin to me, because I did not die, because I did not kill myself. In my introduction proper, I share that the 5-chapter structure of the book moves according to the historicist and comparative organizing logics from the mid-19th through the early 20th centuries, tracking the unfolding imbrications of genealogies of racialized, queer, and gendered modes of unfeeling in relation to issues such as abolition, decolonization, women's rights, and immigration. There is, however, an underlying third element which I confess. Through the book's organization, I've worked through my own positionality in relation to histories, nations, structures, disciplines, communities, and loved ones, deferred until the end according to the usual scholarly suspension, if not denial, of any effective attachments to my work. Only after my discussion in my final chapter of queer, disabled, Chinese North American woman writer Sui Sun Far, an Oriental scribbility, which can only come after establishing the political and aesthetic negotiations with unfeeling by Black, Indigenous, and white queer minoritized subjects, when I can then move on to my coda, which ever so carefully encodes my own vulnerable experiences as a queer, disabled, Chinese diasporic woman scholar living and working in different anti-Black, settler colonial, and colonial spaces. I think sort of see myself as really trying to embody what Candace Chu famously said about Asian diasporic studies, about the importance of how it operates as a subjectless discourse, which is not outside my lived experience, but one that does not center me, although comes from my lived experience, my theory in the flesh. To paraphrase bell hooks, I am attempting to produce theory from my own location of pain and struggle. Yeah, what I understand myself to be exposing, as what she says, a means to chart new theoretical journeys, are not so much my wounds, but actually what I call my affective callousness, as I analyzed in the quotes that I gave from Anzaldúa and Lord. The recognition that my work is what Sherry Moraga and Gloria Anzaldúa call theory in the flesh came out of practical necessity in the most basic material ways. I am theorizing out of multiple chronic illnesses, out of suicidal ideation, out of complex PTSD, out of precarity. I was theorizing out of the disruption that comes from moving institutions and changing geographies, across national boundaries, separate from communities that sustain me, and out of the desperation to build them anew. I was theorizing from the cracks of different healthcare schemes, the chasms between existing care and new medical specialists, the unpredictable, unstable gaps between when existing prescriptions run empty and the assurance of new medical scripts. The agonizing wait as new apparatuses are set into uncertain motion with the unknown rhythms of evaluations and tests. A project which grew out of a more conventional dissertation in 19th century American literary studies that engaged race, gender, and sexuality transformed during the unstructured time of the postdoctoral fellowship in a different country, time zones away, and an institution known for being a site of Indigenous studies and with a Center for Social Justice, then directed by Denise Ferrer de Silva. New networks of citation coincided with new networks of care. Inspired by the work of new friends and the changing interests of old friends, I read new and different work. I read and reread differently. I turned to citations of queer, feminist, Black, Indigenous, and Asian diasporic studies because of the convergent disaffections of queer, feminist, Black, Indigenous, and Asian diasporic friends. I lay dormant, I lay fallow. And by this, I mean I lay down on a floor for months, dormant and fallow, unable to write and unable to read. Antisociality as intellectual method, for all the formal and informal practice of community care that sustained me, I actually avoided sharing and discussing what felt like the true heart of what I was theorizing as unfeeling. I could strategically collaborate. I could tactfully disseminate research to perform productivity, but still I withheld in ways that I admit are counterintuitive and counteractive. Indeed, nowadays, there's a perverse pleasure for me to hear from those close to me, those who are around me, that they did not realize this was the work I was undertaking, that they did not realize this is what I was doing behind closed doors. And indeed, perhaps this type of delinking of types of intimacy. In the final editing of the manuscript and the drafting of the coda, a structural afterthought about a personal point of origin took place when I lived alone during the first coronavirus lockdown, more isolated as well as more hyper-connected than ever. Indeed, this is also what leads to the artwork that adorns the front of my book, which of course I have behind me. And it gives me such joy when people tell me how beautiful they think my book is, because it's dependent on the work by a friend that I made during my postdoc, by Lucia Lorenzi, a queer feminist Black artist and scholar in her own right. And it was during that first lockdown, and I was seeing her post on Instagram about the art that she was doing. And I saw this piece in this collection that she was calling Intimacies. And as soon as I saw it, I knew that she in Vancouver, me in London, that somehow this spoke to the type of survival, the type of kinship that we are navigating together and in conversation with each other, both then as well as now, as fellow long COVID sufferers now and as spoonies even back then. Ellen Samuels writes, "Crypt time means listening to the broken languages of our bodies, translating them, honoring their words. My work in Disaffected comes out of crypt time. This part of the talk of reflecting on my book that I'm giving with you is born out of what Alison Kafer calls an attempt to mark crypt time through form. Insofar as Bell Hooks says she saw in theory then a location for healing, although she says she wanted to make the hurt go away, She does not make a claim to be healed. The premature deaths of scholars of color, particularly Munoz, weigh on me, for I'm finding it nigh impossible to fully realize for myself what Moya Bailey discusses as an ethics of pace for crypt time. And indeed, I am working and writing and speaking to you in ways still benumbed. But in closing, I want to draw your attention to other ways that my citational practice continues to speak to me and the way that I continue to understand my relationship to these theorizations. In the introduction to Disaffected, I cite Raymond Williams. And in my conclusion, as I have here before you, my epigraph is from Audre Lorde. Only after the book was done, during the iterations of book talks, which enables the continual revisiting of my own writing and thinking, do I begin to more fully, consciously apprehend how Williams and Lorde are in conversation for me, not through relations of precedent or displacement, but through this distance juxtaposition at the beginning and end of my book. Our citations speak to each other and to us in ways harmonious and discordant that are not necessarily partitioned by, but rather may be informed by, the differing times and circumstances of our reading, the differing schools of thought they are said to occupy, the differing geographies and positionalities from which they arise. In Williams's formulation of what he terms structures of feeling, he writes, feeling is chosen to emphasize the distinction from the more formal concepts of worldview or ideology. It is not only that we must go beyond formally held and systematic beliefs, though of course we have always to include them. It is that we're concerned with meanings and values as they're actively lived and felt, and the relations between these and formal or systematic beliefs are in practice variable, including historically variable, over a range from formal assent to private dissent, to more nuanced interaction between elected and interpreted beliefs, enacted and justified experiences. Although Williams specifies them as that he calls them structures in order to attend to how they are structured, despite their informality, I also speculate that structures can also refer to how they're structured but structural. And so, turning to Audre Lorde, the metaphoric house may be one such structure under racial capitalism. In her much cited, but perhaps much less seldom fully read essay, The Master's Tools Cannot Dismantle the Master's House, Audre Lorde says the following before she delivers the iconic statement that serves as the title of her essay. Those of us who stand outside the circle of the society's definition of acceptable woman, those of us who have been forged in the crucibles of difference, those of us who are poor, who are lesbians, who are Black, who are older, know that survival is not an academic skill. It is learning how to stand alone, unpopular and sometimes reviled, and how to make common cause with those others identified as outside the structures in order to define and seek a world in which we can all flourish. And indeed, this is in the way I see myself as speaking to one of the primary clashes, as it's seen to be, in queer theory and queer color critique between Lee Edelman on negativity and Jose Munoz thinking about the utopian and the hopeful. And yet to see that they're not necessarily oppositional, the way that they may be in apposition to each other. And indeed, I'm very much indebted to both for the sort of thinking that led to me be able to analyze my own forms of unfeeling in order to write this book. So in this quotation, I think that reading it next to Raymond Williams, we could see this additional insight on Lorde's thinking. The anti-sociality is structural, and that Lorde highlights that such positionality can be trained into a stance of solidarity. One can build other houses, other structures that can decenter the master's house as the only structure that can give shelter and organize a community. Again, she says, learning how to stand alone, unpopular and reviled, that holds space for the importance of antisocial alienation alongside how to make common cause with those others identified as outside the structures. Lorde's figuration of the master's house provides a way of critiquing dominant and prevailing structures of feeling, raising the possibility of unfeeling as a radical break towards other insurgent structures of feeling. And in closing, I want to turn to my coda. I have been called a machine and accused of being cold. I have chosen to remain expressionless when the racist and sexist microaggressions of everyday life have been directed at me. As a woman of color, I find that sometimes the performance of being unaffected is a form of resistance that enables the immediate safety of people like me and denies aggressors the satisfaction of seeing our affectability. Many people I care about have confided their suppressing of emotions to get through situations, numbing themselves to weather exhausting onslaughts of iterative traumas, and shutting down to defend against exposure. A moment to quotidian violence jabs at you in a professional setting. You, junior and precarious, weigh your vulnerability, and might choose to be unresponsive. But sometimes we can turn to our chosen communities where we can be vulnerable, to be seen, processed, and organized. I suspended the expression of my effective investments until the end of this book. This project came out of my pondering the unfeeling alienation of those dear to me and my own disaffections as a non-Black, non-Indigenous woman of color on traditional lands of the Cayuga Nation, as well as later in the unseceded, ancestral, occupied, and traditional lands of the Musqueam people, and now in the former heart of empire. I had to take seriously, for my own sake and the sake of others, the ongoing act of reading queer and feminist to color critique as theory in the flesh. As I struggled with loss, chronic health problems, precarity, I increasingly became aware of how my friendships, in particular with women and queers of color, were the ways in which the praxis of coalition unfolds. Scenes repeat themselves. A white activist censures their guilt at a Black Lives Matter candlelight vigil. Settlers end up taking over space meant for Indigenous students, and cisgender heterosexual allies complain about exclusion from LGBTQ2S+. White fragility shatters in front of us. We exchange side glances as we refuse to wipe away their tears, and then in our alternative social spaces, in group messages, and in hidden social media groups, we commiserate and strategize. In one instance, a friend recounted to me how she and another Black woman student activist ended up giving each other the same present by accident, a mug with white tears printed on it, thereby symbolically transforming a source of frustration into material and psychic nourishment that, sip by sip, may help to sustain them through everyday encounters with the sentimental apparatuses of oppression. We have had to become so strong, impervious, and seemingly invulnerable. If we expose our sensitivities, we are soon scarred. We develop a thick skin to endure the abrasions of everyday life, a protective callousness. A friend calls attention to my impenetrable emotional armor that I wield in tandem with detached professionalisms to keep others at a distance. As effective as that tactic might be, it means I have shifted effective labor onto others. So I must learn to be strategically vulnerable. Across geographies and time zones, we help each other, the shifting calculus of disclosures and withholding, to make sure we can still be responsive and responsible to those we love. Together, we guard our tendernesses beneath the shield of disaffection. But critical demeanors and ways of being together emerge when we reclaim unfeeling from its demonization as moral and social annihilation, and consider its appearance of negation does not obviate or even conceal, but rather can enable generative and insurgent capacities. The antisocial declaration, I don't care, meets we don't care. A mode of self-care grows into collective care. We can be disaffected together. It is no accident that during the later development of this book about unfeeling, I found myself writing about solidarities amongst colonized, racialized, and otherwise minoritized peoples, because that is what has kept me alive. Detaching from hegemonic feelings and decentering them are necessary for flourishing. Disaffection converges with disidentification. Yes, we are unfeeling, and perhaps that should be feared, because it is a tool we can use to tear down dominant structures of feeling to build anew. Let us brace disaffection as an important tool in what Sarah Ahmed calls a killjoy survival kit, instead of hastening to reassure ourselves that majoritarian feelings still matter to us. Empathy tends to be the word that circulates today instead of sympathy. The logic is that sympathy is a false feeling that masks and reinforces power differentials, while empathy is the truer form of feeling across difference. Empathy, good; sympathy, bad. However, this nominal shift from Adam Smith's fellow feeling disavows the episteme that produced universal sympathy by bestowing a fresh name on the unchained concept that is still bound to the same biopolitical hierarchies that in turn undergird the liberal politics of recognition. The imbricated fantasy of right feeling, politics, and action endures as a foundational justification for the importance of reading, teaching, researching, and creating literature at a time when the humanities are under attack by the neoliberal university that demands instrumentalization. Instead of economic value, we offer moral worth. We need to reconsider how we approach anti-racist social justice work in our institutions, pedagogy, activist spaces, and workshops. As we critique the liberal politics of recognition and inclusion, can we address the necessity of the antisocial and exclusionary moves by the marginalized? To notice how we're moved or not moved by others, structured by the governmentality of aesthetics and representation. Perhaps the field of politics itself must change in the face of the incompatible, inconsistent, and stubbornly instrumentalizable. Acknowledge rather than disavow your negative feelings about the unsympathetic refusals, but then train yourself to decenter your hurt feelings at the starting point for redressing the effective biopolitical hierarchy. Unfeeling is a ruse when only some feelings are privileged as true. So let us push beyond the claim that all feelings matter. And finally, I thank you so much for being in community with me here. And just to also emphasize that the strong words that in which I was able to begin my talk, that I begin with my book, were things that came when I did not know if I had a future in academia. And I suppose that in itself allows one to write in certain ways. And so for me, I guess it's also the way that I want to caution. I want to give my stories not as a blueprint, but I think as one potential map, but also to sort of underline that in no way do I want to show it, to uphold it as something, as a meritocratic accomplishments in the sort of linear trajectory of what a successful academic career is to be like. Indeed, speaking to audiences, particularly with junior scholars, I always think that I do not want to be in the position of being a Judas goat. For those of you who might not know, a Judas goat is the goat that is used to call the other goats, to think that things are okay in the Galapagos because of colonial imposition. There's the overpopulation of goats, and then the helicopter comes down and kills the rest of the goats. This is why in the UK right now we are on strike. We do not want academia and the process of the sort of reading and thinking we do to be a Ponzi scheme, to be a pipe dream that we're selling the next generation. And of course, a career in academia is not the only route to fulfillment or the route to a good life. And indeed, that we also need to points to other ways of being and navigating through the ways of thinking and being together that are possible within the space of the university. And I think I'll leave it there. Thanks so much. I think that was exactly an hour, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Xine. Thank you for, sorry, I'm just unmuting. Thank you for introducing us to the work of Disaffected. Thank you also for your kind of presentness with us in this moment, but also with the process of writing this book. Thank you for the kind of meta commentary you've offered on what it was to produce this book, taking us through elements of your own just kind of experience and feeling and journey and movement. So thank you so much for that. And also thank you for your generosity of thought, right? Like with regard to students, junior faculty, and other folks within the academy who endure a kind of precarity, right? So I'm very, very grateful for that. I'm incredibly, and knowing something about Disaffected, incredibly moved by your reflections on it. I'll have more time with you tomorrow, happily, so I don't want to spend too much time talking and just in direct dialogue. I'd like to open it up for questions from folks who are in the audience. I'll once again ask you to please put your questions in the Q&A little function at the bottom of your screen. And then we have about, just about a half hour for questions. You know, Xine, while I'm waiting for questions to see them, one of the things that I was, to see when they come up, one of the things that I was thinking a lot about, particularly as you were talking, was the way in which Unfeeling as a kind of, as a refusal of a kind of, not only expression, but a kind of will to self-transparency, right? That there's a way to conceptualize that as a kind of antisocial effect or antisocial maneuver, but that it doesn't necessarily preclude the building of relation, right? Or the building of coalition and the building of collaboration. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the just questions around sociality in relation to affect, but also in relation to the kinds of feelings that cluster under disaffection as you talk about it in the book and here.
Thank you. And so I just have to say that thinking about the negative, of course, I'm unsurprisingly very inspired by the work of Xine and Sarah Ahmed, who I think have given us so much, a real grammar to think about in terms of like the possibility of negative feelings, ugly feelings, and the forms of alienation that they embody. Um, and what I see is that I'm trying to do with thinking about unfeeling is very much in conversation with that, but also about questioning the very legibility of any form of feeling to any form of like expression to relative inexpression. And for both positive emotions that can be seen as positive as well as those that are negative or ugly, and sort of marking the way that when obviously certain bodies, certain populations perform a negative affect is seen very differently than with others. I think that the very clear example within the US, we could think about the very different confirmation hearings of the Supreme Court. And obviously the way that, yes, one of them ended up crying and bawling and being really angry and talking about beer, whereas the other most recent had to be exemplary. And yet at the same time, who gets characterized as angry. And of course, Farah Ahmed talks about the angry Black woman as a particular instantiation of the type of affect alien that she analyzes. And so that's also a point that I tried to make in the book, is like that it also doesn't matter how positive or how demonstrative one is in terms of feeling, if it's always seen as invalid. And I think that's the point that I was trying to make with like the way that a form of Black unsympatheticness operates, where this sort of the framework means that no matter what, if it's an expression or an expression, it's seen as invalid when it no longer fits the sort of contract of recognition, as we see in Herman Melville's Benito Cereno, that once Babbo is not performing it within this triangulation of this sort of white homosociality, then it doesn't matter what he or any of the other insurgent Africans are trying to do. Like it's just going to be seen as like not valid as feeling as such. And so like I think that there's the multi part to it, which I'm trying to emphasize is, on the one hand, that again, like it's important to stay with the negation of unfeeling and not to have to recuperate it, but also, even though it shouldn't have to be instrumentalizable, and indeed like someone like Babbo is under no like refuses even in court to speak at the end, that he knows that it doesn't matter about performing to those politics of recognition. Nonetheless, sociality exists in another realm of the social, that I guess is the way to see it, is like the antisocial affects show that which is characterized universally as the social. And here I'm sort of riffing off of obviously Sylvia Winter's work and Denise Ferrer de Silva's in terms of like the overrepresentation of white enlightenment man as universal. Like likewise, like that form of the social is not the only game in town, is I think was important to recognize. And I see that there's Q&A.
Yeah, there are some good questions. Do you want me to read them, or I'm happy to read them out? I'm looking at the second question. Could you talk about the feeling of obligation to empathize with those who refuse empathy? Is it a mistake to assert our own humanity by continuing to empathize, or is it a form of self-neglect? Why is this sense of obligation so intractable?
Thank you, Gilbert. So the way that I put it in my book is like the way that the word unsympathetic as well as unsympathetic operates. That in both cases, it's a word that cuts both ways. In order to be seen as sympathetic, you have to be sympathetic to. Likewise, if you're unsympathetic to power, therefore they'll be unsympathetic to you. And it sort of feels like a zero-sum game. Well, not a zero-sum game. It's probably I think I just wanted to use the phrase because it's cool. No, it's what I guess like the point I'm trying to make is that it requires this sort of mode of recognition, but to realize that there's other frameworks that can be built that like where can energy best be placed. I guess it's when you say, is it a mistake to assert our own humanity to continue to emphasize, or is it a form of self-neglect? I think that I would never want to demonize the tactics that people need for survival, but in looking at the work, say again, of Harriet Jacobs, as I pointed out, she's doing this work but she doesn't want to have to do it. And there's a sort of a thread that goes through her work and Lord's work and so many others, of like the necessity of articulating feeling, but also not wanting to be under the obligation to have to do that. And so that's why I think that for me, it's been really important to sort of read, like, also against the way that feminists and queer of color theorists talk about these things, because I think that obviously they are so recognized as talking about unfeeling when their unfeeling has not been when their feelings haven't been recognized. But I also say that the corollary is like that requires certain forms of pushing back the obligation to have to empathize, to center other people's feelings, precisely because it's this sort of the same sort of structural obligation, which means having to recenter those who've always been centered.
I mean,
Yeah.
the example of incidence is really powerful too, because even in the quote that you provide from her intro, Jacobs talks about wanting to arouse the feeling, right? So in some ways, kind of engaging in that practice of antebellum slave narratives and of sentimental texts of the 19th century, of trying to kind of engage the emotions of a reader, right? And in this case, toward an abolitionist purpose, but at the same time wanting to nonetheless engage in forms of concealment, right? So not wanting to necessarily offer herself up, right, in all of the painful experiences of her life, right, just offer them up for consumption. So it's just really I mean, it's just incredibly complex and brilliant, the work that she has to do as an antebellum author, right? Black woman, formerly enslaved, to narrate her experiences, right? To engage sympathy without being so overly revelatory and known.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I guess like the thing with Gilbert, you said like, why is the sense of obligation so intractable? Is like, that's also why to me, like the 19th century, for many reasons, is so fascinating, because it's so characterized as this era of sentiment and sympathy, that it's like the way that Harriet Beecher Stowe has this oversized presence in terms of like how we continue to think about the work that literature does to make you feel for others, even though, yes, there's like, oh, yes, it's also horribly anti-Black. Um, and yet to sort of say like, well, at the same time, despite the way that she made this formula, which has continued to dominate our consciousness, people were always dissenting against it, also trying to make space for otherwise, to make it less, to be the ones who are intractable rather than the sense of obligation itself being intractable. And so, for instance, like in my fourth chapter, thinking about Black women doctors, I sort of trace the sort of structural unfeeling to this iconic essay by Darlene Clark Hine about the culture of dissemblance among Black women as a way of navigating sexual violence, and like the forms of concealments, and then also looking at the 19th century, that the writing by Black women doctors and Frances Elkin Watkins Harper is very much, I think, about also the type of theorizing that was happening at that time in the 19th century. And likewise, in my fifth chapter, I look at the role of Chinese migrants and mixed race Chinese people, despite the pressures of the Chinese exclusion era, which saw Chinese people being painted as aliens. Like there's also the possibility of refusal and the withholding of being like, well, yes, maybe that these migrants don't care about America because literally their families are still overseas, and so their hearts do belong elsewhere. And this sort of like is a way to perhaps nuance the sort of defensive Asian American liberal defensive move, which is always like, but I'm American, I'm an American citizen. This is how American I am. Because sort of see oh dear, you can see this manifest very clearly in the political sphere, like that the sort of overcompensation from being seen as an alien, as an alien, it becomes sort of hyper performance of Americanness. But indeed, like as I was pointing out, doing that to 19th century, Suisse and Farr, despite the high stakes, the seeming sense of obligation being intractable because it has real legislative, physical consequences for whether people be allowed in the nation, will be exposed to certain types of violence, there were these forms of withholding and refusal and careful negotiation with the forms of what was being revealed to sentimentalism.
Thank you. So is there another question? Is there a literary text that is included in the book that surprised you when you return to it or read it within your own book's framework? Like how have the books promoted thinking that you might not have considered, right, in retrospect?
Yeah, so I'd say like there's another very late edition for me in my very first chapter, because I always knew, because I wanted to talk about Herman Melville's Benito Sereno, but it was only in that phase of the precarity and not, and sort of getting to the points, to put it bluntly, of like not giving a fuck, because I wasn't sure if I would continue that, of being like, oh, actually, this is coming out of frustration of how much people love Bartleby. And I feel like this is something you're also seeing in 19th century Americans, because like everyone loves Melville, everyone like Bartleby is so useful to teach. It is so useful to like mobilize for so many different political things. But at the same time, I just felt this sort of exhaustive sympathy that is always extended to Bartleby, which then when you read Bartleby, you see it like it's mirrored by the lawyer that he works for, like who just continually extends sympathy, no matter how seemingly withdrawing and obstinate Bartleby becomes, because he sort of recognizes his humanity as a white man throughout. And I just sort of felt, and for me, I like being able to actually articulate, like, you know, not Bartleby, but Babbo, for me was a very important thing of actually speaking to what I think has been very generative in 19th century American literary criticism, as well as like so many other discussions. Like Lee Edelman has this whole essay thinking about Bartleby in relation to Occupy and so forth. And but also seeing like what, when you continue to fetishize this subject of seemingly universal resistance, what does that include? And so for me, like I think like sort of venting that frustration was something that I was able to come back to. Yeah, and I guess like there's like, see, these are also so many texts that I teach, and so it's been really interesting for me to sort of think through the trajectory of how I've engaged with these texts when I first read them versus when I first researched on them versus the first time I taught them to when I had to write on them again versus when I teach them again. And I feel like it's just become this like wonderfully, I don't know, scale it, like, um, I don't know, like beautiful generative process of thinking about the complexities of how we read, especially when I think, again, there's this tendency to read 19th century American and earlier texts in ways that are very flat, and especially minoritized by minoritized subjects as ways of just being like, oh, this is the window into how it was back then. This is the window into this experience. They had to do this in order to be recognized as human. And actually, that doesn't do justice to the complexity of the writing and the thinking that is embodied in those texts.
Can I ask you to talk about how you see this book just in relation to affect studies in general now? I mean, early on, in the book, you quote Tyrone Palmer, for example. So can you just kind of talk about the way in which the book is intervening into affect studies, changing its objects, asking us to think differently about it?
Yeah. I finally got to meet Tyrone this summer, actually, which was really awesome. And so I'm very grateful to that, because again, so I started my postdoc in 2016, and that's when I started reading Denise's work. And then I was like, well, affectability you can think about with affect. And then I think Tyrone's, as it came out 2017, and I was like, there's also this interesting moment, like when you're like an emerging scholar, you're like, no, I feel like I have the scoop. But I was like, no, this is not how I should think about that. That is such a like a white supremacist idea of firstism. And for me, it's been really important to be able to cite him, because someone who has been able to do this work and like sort of convergent evolution, I think in this really productive way of thinking about disaffection, which I think speaks to the way that I'm trying to think about it. Again, this type of anti-sociality, this dissatisfaction that he has, before we ever met, and that we similarly felt, and then taking that type of disaffection and then reading Denise's work and being like, no, this is because her work can actually illuminate in this other way, and like becomes a prism that allows us to see how a type of refusal of affect studies is writ large on the scale of global modernity, as De Silva's thinking allows us to see. And yeah, I guess it really does come back to the point that I made about not seeing myself as someone who would necessarily work in affect, or that I could be someone who does certain types of work. And I guess this is also particularly for people, those of you in graduate school right now, is I also often talk to a friend of mine who also has an amazing book, Bridget Fielder, Relative Races, thinking about comparative racialization. And we both joke that like as women of color, like during our PhDs, we always felt like we were not going to be the theory people. Like we didn't feel like we were like they were the theory bros, and then there were us, and then we're like, and now who published with Duke? So I guess there's sort of, and we sort of joke about we really want to be able to. We haven't had because of the pandemic, we haven't been able to be at the same conference at the same time to take pictures next to each other, holding up our books. But I really hope that that moment comes. So I do think it's a sense of like feeling like, are you part of certain conversations? And also the weirdness I also want to acknowledge of like, I did not publish an article that was about the main argument of my book until the book itself came out. And so that's, I also feel that's been some interesting about the reaction, because like I published stuff about the historical part, but I didn't actually share any of my thinking about theorizing Unfeeling until the whole book came out. And so it was interesting when my introduction came out, I sort of noticed like suddenly like people perceiving me. And this is something I talked about with Tyrone, and it's up to people to talk about it, but like we're talking about the interestingness of like when you publish something as an essay versus in the book form, and how people can respond to you and what they also anticipate and how they want to put you into different into conversations. And I guess in my way, like I'm glad that I was able to do this all at once, even though I didn't have the confidence to send out any parts of it to a major journal that would help to establish my name and help me to get a book contract and stuff like that. And so I did the sort of like withholding that I mentioned in my process. And I think that sort of isolation perhaps helped me work through things in a way differently than if I had been forced to be in conversation earlier. And I guess it's interesting because like just being parts of like affect studies groups on Facebook that I haven't been a part of, like the affect studies 2 readers coming out, and I'm not in it. But not because I'm not making a slight, it's just because like they literally didn't know I existed while they're putting it together. And sort of like the sort of funniness of that. So in a way, I feel like it's only appropriate in some ways. Like it's sort of not intentionally, but formally sort of suggests sort of outsideness. But I don't want it to, but at the same time, I would say that like people like Greg Seaworth have reached out to me, have been very nice. One person who's written a lot in the history of emotions, Rob Bodice, has been really nice and like wrote a really great review of my book, and has said like that my book was able to articulate things that he's felt frustrated about with the history of emotions he'd never been able to do. So like, I also don't, again, I think that the word appositional as opposed to oppositional is really important here. So, because I don't want to be like, ooh, I'm too cool for school. Like, I think it's just, that's also not true.
Okay, we have, excuse me, we have about 10 more minutes. If there are other questions, please put them in the Q&A, and just put them in the Q&A and we'll read them out. Excuse me. If it's okay, Xine, I have another question while we wait.
Yeah,
that's okay. You know, one of the kind of rubrics, the seminar is structured around 6 rubrics, and one of them is ruinous affects, the temporality of ruin, ruinous socialities, but there's another one that's after ruin, solidarity and suture. And, you know, I thought about this book in connection to many of those, for it spoke to me in many ways across those different kind of rubrics that I was thinking about as structuring the seminar. But one of the reasons that it really kind of stayed with me as I was thinking about ruin and its afterlives and aftermaths is just that the terrain and the processes of forming social collectives are not ones that we can fully anticipate,
yes.
Right? In some ways, right? So solidarity and suture in the rubric has a question mark after it. And one of the things that I think about so often is that when we, in politics, we in our activism, we in our study kind of conceptualize a world anew or think about possibilities otherwise, we often foreground relationality as kind of central to that imagining, that somehow part of what's so disastrous about our world is the failure of feeling and relating properly. And so I've been interested, I'm very interested to think about how the kinds of social collectives and the social lives that we create will not be based necessarily on certain modes of relationality, right? So that we have to somehow move beyond the notion that the ethical posture and ethical beingness is manifested via performances of care, for example, right? Like I often feel, even as myself, that I perform my ethical beingness by demonstrating other people's presumption that I care, right? Now, now that's problematic, right? Like in some ways, right? Because there's the angry Black woman, but then there's also the ramification of professional Black women, right? And so maybe that these kind of the new social lives and collectives that we will create that are toward flourishing will kind of necessitate some of these ruinous affects, right? And will in some ways require us to think about sociality and relationality differently, right, from how we typically do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess like one thing I also think about in academia is also like we are supposed to be, well, in the UK they use the term like pastoral, which I think is quite a funny term to use it, but like sort of the care that we have for our students, which of course is really important, but and the sort of difficulty that during like because of COVID, like the need for care is more than ever. But also like the difficulty of like that we also need care as well, and we're not exhaustive fonts of care. And one thing I've tried to do in my pedagogy is not just to simply give it, but also I think to try and model a type of reciprocity in my pedagogy. And so I found like my students are really supportive of me. I'm really supportive of them. Like that's something that hopefully we have a sort of it helps sort of balance it, and it helps to go beyond also like the consumer model of the student and the university. But yeah, it's just it's difficult, and I guess I also think about how Tuck and Yang talk about like sort of an ethic of commensurability and like what place that has in solidarity and a type of and that the way that incommensurability is a disruption of the sort of Adam Smith notion of fellow feeling. And that was also like one of the motivations behind my second chapter on Martin Delaney, and trying to think across like the tensions between like Black and Indigenous subjects and particularly with that Black studies and Indigenous studies as a field are sometimes are artificially siloed and some and yeah, but and yet there's a lot of important work that's trying to think across say like Black indigeneity or think about Black Native people in the US, for instance. And part of what I was trying to do in that chapter is that looking at Delaney, I think like he is trying to model something that is able to reclaim Black indigeneity, but also be in community with Indigenous peoples of what's now called, what some people call Turtle Islands. And that is quite messy, but there's such a necessity of doing that work. And that's something I really got out of talking with a friend of mine in Indigenous studies, Katie Walkowitz, who works on Indigenous studies and Black studies together. And she and their point was also like that solidarity is difficult by design. Like a sort of afterlife colonialism wants to make us think it's difficult and impossible. Like it also has a vested interest in keeping us divided. And so on the one hand, it's like a simplistic call to unity is not the answer. But at the same time, it's like working with all the tensions of that acronym BIPOC, which has many like very valid critiques of the way it has basically come in as like the latest version of POC, and yet somehow still managed to allied Black and Indigenous people despite being prominently at the beginning of the acronym. But actually, what if we made each of those parts really in tension with each other in the sort of awkwardness of that acronym? And so that's something that really motivates my thinking in the book, but also across other writing that I've done, where I think about Black and Asian intimacies, and I also think about Asian indigeneities and Asian settler colonialisms. And so it's one of those things where, so later in my career, I really tried to tap into my own lived experience, thinking through problems that I'm having structurally in relation to the objects that I'm studying, and I'm trying to find out something about myself in that sort of work.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Thank you so much. I'd love to rethink, as I was saying, just the kind of the ethical posture right, for, what it is to kind of inhabit a kind of ethics, right? That's oriented toward, just the well-being of the racialized, the minoritized, the marginalized, right? The gendered, right? So just to kind of be able to sever a certain kind of feeling, a certain kind of orientation, a certain kind of again, transparency, interior transparency made, that is expressed and revealed, just offering other kinds of, postures, politics that might themselves be oriented toward or be captured under the rubric of an ethics, is, I think, a beautiful promise, and one of the promises of your work.
Thank you. I also say that it's also, well, with the acronym EDI, DEI, and like the sort of obligation that we have to do so much of that service work, is something that I've really been thinking is like being 5 years into my first faculty position, and its necessity, but also its limitations and its disappointments, but also like realizing like, because I also do think that the work of that sort of institutional recognition isn't the only plane on which I'm operating, like that helps. It's like, again, thinking that isn't just one politics of recognition, that is the institutional politics, but also knowing that it's going to disappoint you, but like there's so many other ways, so many other stages for approaching things. And I also guess I also think of that saying that Miriam Kaba has, which is like, let this not lead you to despair, but to radicalize, which I think is really useful.
That's right. That's right. Xine, thank you so much for being here with us this evening. I am so delighted that I and folks in the seminar will have more time with you tomorrow to continue these conversations. We're going to let you go now and get some dinner, and we'll see you tomorrow. Thank you so much.